Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
Welcome to another episode of International Law Behind the Headlines. This is Cal Raustiala, and I'm really pleased to have as our guest on the podcast today, Professor David Sloss, who is the Sutro Professor of Law at Santa Clara Law School here in California. And David is the author of a relatively new book just out in April called Tyrants on Twitter, Protecting Democracies from Information Warfare. Certainly a timely topic, important topic. And I invited David on the podcast to talk about the book and get into some of the issues, which I think you'll find interesting. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really important issue or set of issues that you address in the book, and we'll get into some of the details and your proposals, but maybe just give the listeners a kind of capsule summary of what you are trying to accomplish with this book. I've sort of mentioned the topic, and obviously social media is embedded in the title, but tell us the gist of your book.
Yeah, so the book really consists of two parts. The first part is examining the problem, and the second part is at least trying to come up with solutions. So the problem I'm focusing on specifically is the use of information warfare by both Russia and China to undermine democracies and promote autocracy around the world. So I link their use of information warfare to the trends that we've been observing now for almost a decade, where we've seen a decline in the percentage of democracies in the world and an increase in the percentage of autocracies. And information warfare can be defined in a variety of ways, but I focus primarily, although not exclusively, on social media as the sort of means for conducting information warfare. And so the book goes into quite a bit of detail looking at separately at China and Russia and how they are exploiting social media and other information technologies to conduct information warfare. And then, as I said, part two of the book really goes into solutions, and in particular, I'm looking for transnational cooperation among liberal democracies to regulate social media to protect democracy. So that's the core idea here.
Terrific. So I want to get into both the kind of phenomenon the problem that you are addressing, which I share the concern about. I think probably everybody does, but then also the proposals. But just as a kind of question of scope, you focus on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. But do you see legacy media, traditional media, as a vector for information warfare as well, and just that's a kind of different project? Or how do you see that fitting in?
Traditional media is also a vector for information warfare, for sure. In fact, if you look at work that's been done looking at the spread of disinformation in the United States, there's a great book by a group of scholars at Harvard called Network Propaganda, which really shows that it's the sort of interplay between legacy media and social media that amplifies the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And we can see some similar studies from other countries, but when we look globally around the world, frankly, there's not a whole lot of good work that's been done that looks at what are the relative contributions of social media versus legacy media. But I think to get complete picture of the problem, you have to look at the interplay between the two, although the book really tries to hone in on social media, in part because I think the appropriate regulatory responses really differ for social media than for legacy media. I'm skeptical about trying to regulate legacy media on a transnational basis, but I think to get at social media, you have to look at regulation on a transnational basis just because of the nature of the technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And one of the, signal features of social media is that it's not that there are zero gatekeepers, but the gatekeeping function that traditionally was played by, editors choosing stories to appear on the front page or the back of the paper or not at all, that's all sort of gone. And there's a kind of, direct, interaction between authors, let's call them, and readers or listeners. And so it does seem like we're in a very different world. And you make that point right in the beginning that, I think many of us I'm personally not a big social media user, but, I think a lot of people did view it as this great thing. And we've certainly seen the kind of dark underbelly now for many years. And so your book does an important job of showing how that developed and kind of where it's going and ideally what we can do about it. So let's get into the scope of the problem. I think one thing I should flag up front is it's interesting, your background as someone with a lot of arms control experience plays a role in how you think about this problem and how you address it. So maybe before we talk about specifics with Russia and China, how did your arms control negotiation experience shape the writing of this book and the way you think about the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So, when I was working on arms control negotiations in my prior career, a lot of the question was, or a lot of the focus was on sort of what we call red teaming for verification, thinking about, well, if we put this verification measure in place, what can they do to circumvent that? And then what, can we do in response to that to prevent them from circumventing that? So I applied that kind of thinking to social media because a lot of the problem that we saw from the 2016 presidential, election in the United States was the Russians setting up these fake accounts. And if you think about what to do about fake accounts, any measure that we adopt to sort of limit the use of fake accounts, they can find ways to circumvent it. So then you get into this sort of back and forth exercise and thinking about, well, if we do X, they do Y to circumvent it. What can we do to defeat that? And I really tried to apply that type of thinking to get into how do we really solve the problem in a way. Look, you can never prevent circumvention, but what you can do is sort of minimize circumvention, make it harder and more costly for them to circumvent whatever system you set up. And so that was really my approach in trying to think through solutions for the problem.
Great. Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And obviously, especially relevant or maybe like a logical map on to the Russian side of things. But you, as you mentioned earlier, you focus in the book on Russia and China primarily, and you talk about kind of the rise of digital authoritarianism. And maybe let's start with Russia. Russia and the U.S. elections, I think, is probably the most salient example in most people's minds. How do Russia and China differ? What's Russia doing today? Give us a kind of sense of the Russian approach to this or the threat posed by Russia.
Yeah, well, actually, let me just start with the question you posed about how do Russia and China differ, because I think that's an important thing to get at. So there's a quote that I like from a former NSC official who said that Russia is a hurricane and China is climate change. And I think that quote nicely captures the differences between them. Russia's approach to information warfare is primarily negative and destructive. They're clearly using information warfare to undermine democracy, undermine NATO and the European Union in particular. And I would say they were having a fair amount of success with that before the war in Ukraine, although the war in Ukraine has changed that calculus a fair amount. China, on the other hand, is really taking a more long-term view. China wants to reshape the international order. Whereas the United States for a long time was trying to make the world safe for democracy, I think China to some extent is trying to make the world safe for autocracy. So China has a more positive vision of a kind of international order it would like to see, and is using information warfare to promote that vision. So I think that's a fundamental difference between the two.
Whereas Russia just benefits from chaos or disorder. Is that the idea that China has, as you say, a positive vision? They have a different sort of order they want to see achieved, whereas Russia's just trying to stay afloat, and so more disorder is better?
I'm not sure that more disorder is better, but certainly Russia has a very strong interest in weakening NATO, weakening the European Union, weakening the democracies in those countries. And Russia's actually devoted a lot of resources to supporting far-right parties in Europe, on the theory that those far-right parties in Europe will actually help advance Russia's foreign policy goals by weakening NATO and weakening the EU, right? But that's not much of a positive vision. It's more of a let's tear down what's there rather than building up something different.
Right. Okay. So sort of burn it all down rather than a kind of more incremental approach.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So China, you kind of contrasted as, I mean, I like that metaphor of climate change versus hurricane. I hadn't heard that. I think that sounds right. In that China tends to take a long view on a lot of things, and is really shaping or attempting to shape a very different sort of order. What would that Chinese order look like? So you said sort of safer autocracy, but what would be the role of China? Has its own social media ecosystem, of course.
Right.
What would be the role of social media or just media, period, in that Chinese order?
Well, one key thing is that China wants to use and is using, right? China is, let's start with domestically. China is domestically using information technology for essentially surveillance and control, right? Information technology helps them keep a handle on their own population. And they're sort of exporting that surveillance and control model to other countries around the world. I don't think China wants to sort of, take over the world. China is perfectly content to see, liberal democracies remain in the United States and Western Europe. But to the extent that they can promote a more autocratic model in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they're trying to do that. And information technology is a part of that because they can essentially, by exporting information technology, help other countries to strengthen autocratic control at home. And social media is a piece of this. There are actually a few different Chinese technology companies that have developed sophisticated tools for essentially using social media for surveillance and control. So they append these tools to Facebook, YouTube, et cetera, and either the Chinese government itself can use these tools to sort of monitor what's going on in social media, or make that technology available to other countries so that other governments with autocratic leanings can do that.
Yeah, let's turn to your proposal, which I think relates a little bit to what you just described, and I guess in a kind of negative sense, as I understood it, which is your proposal, your regulatory proposal, isn't necessarily going to change anything you just described inside China. That's not the goal.
Right.
The goal is really to protect democracies from these kind of baleful influences from external actors. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, that's right. It really does focus on protecting existing democracies. It's certainly not designed to sort of influence what's going on domestically in China and Russia.
Okay, good. So you characterize your proposal as a kind of transnational regulation of social media, and I want to get into some of the details because this is obviously the most kind of up till now we've kind of been talking in general foreign policy terms, but
Right.
Here we kind of get more into what would a legal regime look like, a regulatory regime. What are some of the some of the concrete proposals and maybe some of the challenges that they would face. But one thing you note is, or you propose, is a rule that would prohibit Chinese and Russian, or maybe any foreign agent, from using accounts on social media for these purposes. So how would that work in practice? And just spell that out a little more for us.
Right. Okay. So the basic proposal is to ban from social media platforms anyone who's acting as an agent of the Russian government, the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party. This could be extended to other bad actors like Iran and North Korea, but I really focus in the book on China and Russia. And so in order to ban them, you have to know who they are. And in order to figure out who they are, I propose a registration system. And the registration system is controversial, I recognize, but the basic idea of the registration system is that anybody who wants to operate a public account on social media, and I draw a distinction between public and private accounts, anybody who wants to operate a public account on social media has to register, declare their nationality, and provide certain identifying information so that, for example, if I say, I'm a French citizen, I am handing over enough information so that Facebook can go to the French government and say, hey, is there really a French citizen with this name and this identifying information? And that would be applied up front at the stage of sort of creating an account. And this kind of registration system would effectively allow the social media companies to block, 99% of the fake accounts up front. It wouldn't be foolproof. There would be ways around it. But that's the sort of principal mechanism for determining, because, if that way, let me just say that what the Russians did in 2016, which was really effective, is set up accounts where they pretended to be Americans. So this would make it almost impossible for them to set up accounts in which they assume the identity of an American, because that would be screened up front in the account registration process.
Okay, so it seems like it would have two chief effects. One, the many millions, tens of millions, I don't know, hundreds of millions of bot accounts would be eliminated because it'd have to be a real person behind every account, regardless of nationality, a real person. So that would be one effect, and that's a positive effect in your account because bots are such a important tool in the kind of Russian arsenal in particular. And then the second effect would be to make clear who's speaking. In other words, you were just talking about Russians impersonating Americans. We would know whether the account that says David Sloss is an account of an American citizen or a Russian citizen. Is that right?
Yeah, well, Facebook would know that.
Facebook would know.
So two things. One is, I wouldn't actually eliminate bots altogether, but I would require that bot accounts be registered as bot accounts. There are some actually positive uses for bot accounts, but the bot accounts would be identified as such, and as you said, they would be linked to a real person, so that Twitter or Facebook knows who's operating that account. Right. That's one point. I think it's very important for people to be able to speak anonymously on social media. There's actually constitutional protection in the United States, as you know, for the right to speak anonymously. So I would allow people to speak anonymously, but they would be anonymous to everybody else on the platform. They would not be anonymous to certain people within the company who would essentially, you'd have to have somebody in the companies who would be able to link a pseudonym to a real name. So you can't register anonymously, but you can appear anonymously if you choose to do so.
I see. So, I mean, I can imagine that will be controversial, if only because, of course, these companies can and will be hacked at some point, and that information probably isn't totally safe if you're concerned about your anonymity. But But on the other hand, the current system isn't totally safe either. And so, I suppose that's the kind of balancing that would have to be engaged in when we think about these proposals. So
can I just
go ahead.
I mean, I do recommend a number of measures to protect that identifying information, but one of those measures would be data hashing, and data hashing basically allows you to store data in a way that essentially, even if someone hacks into the system, they wouldn't be able to link a pseudonym to a user's actual identity. Right. So there are measures you can take that make that, obviously nothing is perfect, but there are measures you can take that make that information very secure.
But to clarify, within, let's say, Facebook, certainly someone at Facebook, maybe many people at Facebook, would be able to draw that connection that there is David Sloss, an American citizen residing in San Jose, California, behind the account that is named David Sloss.
Right. There would have to be people in Facebook who would be able to make that connection, but you could limit that to a relatively small number of people in Facebook on a sort of a need-to-know basis.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's keep going on some of there's multiple prongs to your proposal, and we won't be able to get into all of it, but I think that's in some ways the most interesting part of this book is thinking about what can we do. Another element is what you describe as kind of a disclaimer regime that, if there's an election-related message coming from someone outside of the United States, or I guess a non-citizen, is that the idea? So a non-citizen, who would be subject to this disclaimer?
So the book proposes what I call an alliance for democracy, which would consist of about 35 or 40 states that are liberal democracies. So let's just say France is a liberal democracy. It's part of the alliance. Venezuela is not a liberal democracy. It's not part of the alliance. Essentially, what that means is French citizens can comment on U.S. elections with no restrictions whatsoever. So it's not a limit on foreigners. But Venezuelan citizens who want to comment on U.S. elections, their posts on Facebook or Twitter would be accompanied by a disclaimer. The company would be required to attach this disclaimer, and it might say something like, this comment is coming from a citizen or national of a non-democratic country, something like that. So that would provide a warning to you and me when we're seeing stuff on social media that, hey, this is not just that it's coming from a foreigner, but it's coming from somebody who's not a citizen or national of a democratic country.
What about a Venezuelan refugee living here or France?
Okay, so a Venezuelan refugee living in the United States would have the option of registering as a U.S. national when they set up an account on Facebook. And as long as they are a legal, I can't remember now whether I said legal resident or legal permanent resident in the proposal. I have to go back and look at that. But let's just say legal permanent resident could certainly register as a U.S. national on Facebook and essentially claim that nationality by virtue of being a legal permanent resident here.
Okay, so there's a kind of a who you are question, but then also where you are might shift the result a little bit.
Right.
But the basic idea is that within democratic polities, it's perfectly fine to opine on elections here or in other democracies, but it's sort of, we're going to keep it within the family in that sense. And anyone else would be they would still be able to comment, is that right? But there would be a disclaimer that this person is Russian or residing in Russia or something to that effect.
Right, exactly.
Okay, great. So I know we have only a little bit of time left, but I want to just get into very briefly the issues around the First Amendment that are probably in the minds of certainly many American listeners, but also have some resonance in even international human rights instruments and others where free expression is protected in various ways. So what are the chief challenges in terms of free expression? So either at the international level, with regard to human rights instruments, or the First Amendment, which is something you devote a fair amount of time to in the book.
Right. Well, I think just to be clear, all citizens and nationals of states that are members of the Alliance for Democracy would have essentially unrestricted free speech on social media, right? So I think that's important. From a First Amendment standpoint, probably the most controversial thing is banning Chinese and Russian nationals from social media. Not China, I shouldn't say nationals, Chinese and Russian state agents, right? So Chinese and Russian nationals would be allowed on social media as long as they're not acting as state agents. That obviously presents a implementation problem. How do you decide who's a state agent? I deal with that at some length in the book. But those who are acting as state agents would be banned from social media. I'm sure that would be challenged on First Amendment grounds. I think it's very defensible on First Amendment grounds, but I can't guarantee how the court would rule on that. And it presents similar challenges in other countries. I did have one German professor I know who I talked to about the proposal who thought that might also present constitutional problems in Germany. The other thing, though, that may be actually more of a concern, but personally, I have no problem with saying the First Amendment allows us to ban Chinese and Russian state agents from social media. I think the bigger First Amendment concern in some ways is what chilling effect does this have on everybody else, right? If the ordinary social media user is worried that the registration system essentially allows the government to spy on them, then when they're given an option to register either a private account or a public account, they may decide, well, I'm just going to register a private account so that way I don't have to register. I've set up a private account. That way I don't have to register, provide identifying information, and therefore I'm not worried about the government spying on me. So if the result of this system is it drives a whole lot of people from public accounts to private accounts, that really does have a big chilling effect on speech on social media. I would be concerned about that. And I think that that is going to depend a lot on being able to sort of sell these ideas to not just the American public, but to the public in other countries to convince them that registering and handing over this information is not going to become a tool for government spying.
Interesting. And so what about, I'm thinking back to, I think it was Thurgood Marshall who had that quote about the freedom to speak and the freedom to hear being two sides of a coin. So far you sort of focused on free expression and the right of the speaker, but, what if I want to hear what Russian agents have to say? What about that aspect of the First Amendment?
Yeah, so the First Amendment clearly protects the rights of listeners as well as speakers. One thing I would say about that is that there are lots of alternative avenues available where I can hear what, I want to know what RT has to say about, some subject, right? RT is a Russian state media company.
Right.
RT, I can get information from RT just by going onto the RT website. I can find stuff there. I can actually watch RT broadcasts on television, on radio. There are lots of alternative channels of communication that don't involve social media. And the advantage of those is that stuff there is sort of clearly labeled, right? So if I go to the RT website, I know exactly what I'm getting on the RT website. Now, I do have something in the proposal that provides an exemption for benign state agents. So if we decide that RT is a benign state agent, I don't think it is, but somebody would have the authority to decide that RT is a benign state agent. If they decide that, then RT would actually be allowed on social media under that exemption, right? And similar things for the Chinese state media companies. It doesn't, the key point here is it doesn't prevent us from hearing what the Chinese government or the Russian government or Russian or Chinese media companies are saying. It just shuts off one avenue for communication there, but doesn't prevent us from hearing what it is that they're saying.
Okay. But it might block us from hearing some individuals, maybe not institutions or firms like RT. Is that right? Or
and I think that's essential, because what we've seen is the individual accounts tend to operate covertly, right? Those individual accounts are useful for the Chinese and Russian governments only insofar as the people operating those accounts are not identified as agents of the state or agents of the Communist Party. So that's the most important stuff to block off, because that's the most deceptive, right? And I can't see any good reason why we should allow agents of the Chinese or Russian government or agents of the Communist Party to appear covertly on social media and spread messages where people don't even know that message is actually coming from the government.
Yeah, I can understand that concern. I guess one final question about kind of the mechanics of this proposal. So if a private account, let's say, or a disclaimed account coming from a non-democracy says something false about an election here, and then I pick it up, and on my public account, I'm an American citizen residing in California, I start to spread that out, and then of course there's kind of a ripple effect. Maybe it gets spread far and wide. Right. Is there any way that your proposal addresses that dynamic?
Yeah, so the disclaimer basically stays with the message. So let's say somebody from Venezuela posts something on social media making some claim about, Joseph Biden, who's running for re-election in the 2024 election. That would have a disclaimer attached to it because the person is from Venezuela. That disclaimer would then follow the message as long as that original message is sort of shared or retweeted, something like that. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply if you read it and then you just come up with your own original message. You're not copying and pasting. You're not retweeting. You're just repeating the information. You, as an American citizen, are putting it out there. Then the disclaimer is not going to apply, right? But if you're sharing or retweeting that original post, then the disclaimer follows it along.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And, I think looking forward, we haven't seen, we started to see deep fakes as, a real issue, but I think we're just seeing the beginning of that phenomenon. And, while it certainly, remains to be seen how powerful the impact will be of, videos that are, utterly bogus, but, widely shared, it seems like your proposal would at least take a step towards addressing some of those things. Okay, well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I urge listeners to take a look at the book and to buy it and read it. Again, it's Tyrants on Twitter: Protecting Democracies from Information Warfare. David, any last points you want to make about the book or your argument?
No, I would just say that the book is also available as an audiobook. So those of you who prefer to listen rather than read, you can buy the book as an audiobook and listen to it.
Great. Are you the reader of the audiobook?
I am not the reader. The company hired a professional actor to read it, which I'm sure is does a much better job than I would do reading my own book.
Great. Well, I didn't realize that. So that's an interesting, very 2022 twist on book publishing. So thanks again, David, for coming on. And I hope we have you back on the podcast soon.
All right. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.